If you manage to pay for the coffee, I'll give you the restaurant.
If you manage to pay for the coffee, I'll give you the restaurant. The words echoed through the golden-lit cafe like a slap. Laughter burst around the room, bouncing off marble and glass. At the counter stood Ethan, the millionaire owner in his pristine white suit, smirking, certain of his power. Across from him, an old man with trembling hands quietly placed a few coins on the counter. No anger, no shame, just calm. The room went silent. Even the coffee machine seemed to stop hissing, as if the whole place was waiting to see what he'd do next. A coin slipped, rolled across the floor, and stopped between Ethan's polished shoes. He looked down, still smiling. But the old man didn't flinch. He picked it up, placed it back on the counter, and said softly, "Then I suppose we have a deal." The laughter died. The air changed. And what happened after that? No one in that cafe would ever forget. Before we begin this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city you are watching, and don't forget to leave your like to keep following us. The cafe on Mercer Street glowed gold under the morning light, every marble surface polished to perfection. The smell of roasted coffee hung thick in the air, mingling with the faint notes of expensive perfume and laughter. It was the kind of place where suits outnumbered smiles, and every detail screamed wealth. Then the bell above the door rang. Heads turned. An old man stepped in, coat frayed at the edges, shoes worn thin, a faded cap shadowing his eyes. For a moment, silence spread like fog. He paused by the door, scanning the room, before walking, slowly, deliberately to the counter. Coins jingled softly in his trembling hand. Behind the espresso machine stood Ethan, the owner, early 30s, immaculate white suit, hair slicked back, like a man who never lost. His reflection in the brass mirror seemed to smirk before he did. The waitress beside him, nervous but trying to keep her smile, greeted the newcomer politely. "A small coffee, please," the old man said, voice rough but steady. He placed a few coins on the counter, nickels, pennies, quarters, lined up with care. Ethan leaned forward, eyes glinting with amusement. "That's all you've got?" he asked, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. A few of them looked up from their laptops, sensing tension. The old man didn't answer. He kept counting. Ethan's smile sharpened. "Tell you what, old-timer," he said, tapping the marble counter with one manicured finger. "If you can pay for that coffee, I'll give you the restaurant." Laughter rippled through the cafe. The waitress froze, her smile fading. The old man looked down at the coins again, the way someone might look at the pieces of a broken life, slowly, quietly, without shame. A coin rolled off the counter and hit the floor with a sharp metallic clink. It spun in lazy circles before stopping between two polished shoes. Ethan looked down, then back up, grinning. "Careful," he said. "You might lose your fortune." The old man bent to pick it up. His hands trembled, but his posture when he rose was straighter than before. He looked at Ethan, meeting his eyes for the first time. For a second, something flickered there, something that made Ethan's smirk falter. He slid the last coin forward. "That should do," he murmured. Ethan blinked, half amused, half annoyed. "You're serious?" The old man nodded once. "You said if I pay, the place is mine." The laughter died down. The air thickened, as if everyone was holding the same breath. Ethan chuckled under it, trying to break the silence. "Sure," he said finally, waving a hand. "If you manage to pay for the coffee, old man, it's all yours." But when the register beeped, and the total matched the exact pile of coins, the cafe went dead quiet. Even the steam wand hissed like it was listening. The old man smiled faintly, just enough to make Ethan uneasy. He whispered almost to himself, "Then I suppose we have a deal." The sound of the receipt printing filled the silence like the ticking of a clock no one knew had just started counting down. For a long moment, no one moved. The hum of the espresso machine was the only sound in the room, low and restless, like a heartbeat under pressure. Ethan stood frozen, one hand still resting on the counter, staring at the small pile of coins that had somehow bought not just a cup of coffee, but everyone's attention. The waitress, Chloe, glanced between them, her lips parting to say something before she thought better of it. The customers whispered softly, phones discreetly lifted to capture the strange scene. Ethan could feel their eyes on him, judging, enjoying his discomfort. He straightened, flashing his usual confident grin. "Relax, everyone," he said, voice smooth again, though it trembled at the edges. "It's just a joke. Enjoy your coffee, sir. No need to take it so seriously." Edward lifted the paper cup that Chloe handed him, the steam curling upward, fogging his glasses. He looked at Ethan for a moment that felt like a quiet verdict. Then he nodded once. "A man's word," he said softly, "isn't something I'd ever call a joke." That line hit differently. The laughter that had begun to rise from a corner table died instantly. Ethan's grin faltered again. Something about the old man's calmness, his stillness, made everyone uncomfortable. It wasn't defiance, it was certainty. Chloe, trying to diffuse the tension, cleared her throat. "Would you like sugar, sir?" she asked gently. Edward's eyes softened. "No, thank you," he said. "It's already sweet enough being back here." Ethan caught that, frowning slightly. "Back here?" Edward just smiled faintly and turned toward a window seat, his steps slow but steady. He placed the coffee on the table and stared outside, where the city moved like a restless film. Yellow taxis, hurried feet, grey clouds forming over the skyline. Behind the counter, Ethan leaned closer to Chloe. "What does he mean, back here?" he whispered. She shrugged. "Maybe he's just being poetic." Ethan scoffed. "Yeah, sure. Homeless poets with perfect change." But his words came out harsher than he meant, and even Chloe flinched. He looked at her, then at the reflection of the old man in the gold-plated espresso machine. For some reason, he couldn't stop watching him. How calm he was, how his hand never shook when he lifted the cup. It was unnerving. Minutes passed, but the cafe didn't return to normal. The customers spoke in low tones, some sneaking glances toward Edward, others avoiding eye contact entirely. When Edward finally stood to leave, he placed the empty cup on the table with quiet precision, like someone closing a chapter. Then he walked back to the counter and spoke in a tone that made everyone look up again. "Could I get a receipt for my coffee?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "A receipt?" Edward nodded. "Yes, for the record." Chloe turned to the register, printing it without question, but when she handed it over, Ethan noticed the old man's hand linger on the paper, his eyes fixed on the address printed at the top. A smile ghosted across his face. Nostalgic. Private. He folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Then, with a polite nod, he said, "Thank you. It's good to know this place still exists." And just like that, he turned and left, leaving Ethan staring after him, unsettled and strangely curious. When the door closed behind him, the sound of the bell seemed sharper than before, like the start of something no one yet understood. The afternoon crowd had come and gone, but Ethan still couldn't shake the image of that wrinkled hand sliding the exact change across the counter. The cafe hummed with normalcy again, keyboard clicks, the hiss of milk frothing, but it all felt staged, like everyone was pretending nothing strange had happened. He pulled the register drawer open, pretending to check the balance, though what he really wanted was to see the trace of those coins. They were gone. Chloe had cleared them, but the echo of their sound, the tiny metallic clink that had humiliated him, was still somewhere in the back of his mind. From the corner of the cafe, one of his regular customers, a real estate agent, chuckled. "Man, you should have seen your face this morning. That old guy totally flipped your joke on you." Ethan forced a laugh. Yeah. Guy got lucky." But the agent's words had already sunk in. Flipped your joke on you, he hated that. Ethan wasn't used to losing control, especially not in his own restaurant, in front of his clients, his staff, his brand. He leaned back against the counter, eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the city had turned grey. Rain began to fall, tiny dots racing down the glass. And then, almost reflexively, he reached for the trash bin and pulled out the receipt Chloe had printed earlier. It was crumpled but still legible. He smoothed it flat on the counter and read it again. Mercer & Co. Cafe, 241 Mercer Street, New York, NY. He didn't know why, but the address suddenly felt heavy. Like it was more than just a location. It was a memory someone else remembered too well. Chloe noticed him staring. "You okay?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. "Did he say anything before he left?" She frowned, thinking, Only that it was good to know this place still exists. Ethan exhaled slowly, his reflection warping in the gold coffee machine. Still exists, he repeated under his breath. Like he's been here before. Chloe tilted her head. Maybe he has. This building's been here for decades. My grandma said it used to be a bakery or something before your dad bought it. Ethan's eyes lifted sharply. A bakery? Yeah, she said, shrugging. A small family one. She said they made the best rye bread in Manhattan. It was run by some immigrant couple back in the 70s. She couldn't remember their names. Something in his chest tightened. He turned the receipt over and noticed a faint smudge, like an old fingerprint left in ink. He didn't know why, but it made his skin prickle. He folded the paper and slipped it into his suit pocket, next to his watch. If he comes back, he said quietly, let me know. Immediately. Chloe nodded, unsure why his tone had changed. When he walked to the front door to flip the sign from open to closed, he caught a glimpse of a figure across the street, standing under an umbrella. The rain blurred the details, but Ethan could swear it was the same man, still, motionless, watching. Then a passing bus crossed between them, and when it moved, the sidewalk was empty. He stayed there a long while staring at the spot, his hand still gripping the doorknob as the city lights began to flicker on. The next morning, Mercer & Cumwell Cafe opened to the same polished perfection. The marble gleamed, the brass fixtures glowed, and every chair stood in perfect alignment. But to Ethan, everything looked slightly off, like a stage reset after a play that had gone wrong. He arrived earlier than usual, maybe to prove something to himself, to the ghost of the old man, or to the reflection that had haunted him all night. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and silver under the rising sun. When Chloe walked in, she found him behind the counter, cleaning a machine that was already spotless. "You're here early," she said, hanging her coat. Ethan didn't look up. "Couldn't sleep?" She smiled softly. "Still thinking about yesterday?" He sighed. "It's just something about that guy, the way he said it. Back here. Like he owned the place once." Before she could answer, the doorbell chimed. Both turned. The old man stood there again. Same coat, same steady posture, but this time he held something wrapped in a small handkerchief. A hush fell over the cafe. Even the soft jazz playing through the speakers seemed to fade. Edward walked up to the counter and placed the folded cloth in front of Ethan. "You forgot to give me this," he said quietly. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean? I didn't—" The old man unwrapped the handkerchief. Inside lay a small black and white photograph, its edges yellowed with age. Ethan stared at it, confused. The image showed 3 people standing in front of a brick storefront, a younger man with his arm around a woman holding a newborn. Above them, a faded sign, Morris Bakery, 241 Mercer Street. His throat went dry. "Where did you get this?" Edward looked at the photo, not at him. "Here, it was taken right where you're standing." Chloe leaned closer, eyes wide. "Wait, is that—" "Yes," Edward said softly. "That's my wife, Eleanor, and our son." Ethan blinked hard, his pulse quickening. "You mean this was your place?" Edward didn't answer right away. He traced a finger along the photograph, over the smiling faces frozen in time. "Once," he said, "before it was sold, before it was painted over." Ethan took a step back. "Sold to who?" Edward looked up now, his gaze steady, piercing. "Your father." The words hung in the air, heavy as thunder. Chloe's hand went to her mouth. Ethan felt the floor shift beneath him, not literally, but deep in his chest, where denial tried to rearrange itself into disbelief. "That's impossible," he muttered. "My father bought this property from some real estate broker. There were no previous owners listed." Edward's lips curved in a small, knowing smile. Oh, there was an owner. He just didn't think the buyer would ever come looking back. Ethan swallowed hard. He wanted to argue, to push back, but something in the man's tone, measured, almost gentle, made it impossible. Chloe whispered, "Mr. Morris, are you saying you built this place?" Edward looked around the cafe. The marble, the gold, the corporate perfection that had erased every trace of flower and warmth. His expression softened with quiet sadness. "No," he said. I built what was here before it. A place that smelled of bread and hope. Ethan stared at him, speechless. Edward folded the photograph again and handed it to him. I thought you might want to see what you bought. Ethan hesitated before taking it. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment, an electric human instant. And for the first time, Ethan noticed how steady the old man's hands were now. Then Edward turned to leave, pausing only to add, "Keep the picture. Memories have a way of revealing debts." The doorbell chimed again as he stepped into the street, leaving Ethan frozen behind the counter, clutching a past he didn't know belonged to him. Outside, the city moved on, but Ethan's reflection in the glass stayed still, holding the photo against his chest like it burned. That night, Ethan sat alone in his office upstairs, the photograph lying flat on the desk under the yellow glow of a vintage lamp. The noise of the city seeped through the windows, distant sirens, a cab horn, a dog barking somewhere in Soho. But inside, everything was still. He couldn't stop looking at the faces in the picture. The younger Edward, proud and smiling, his wife radiant beside him, and a baby bundled in her arms. The sign above them, Morris Bakery, was faint, but its presence felt louder than the silence surrounding him now. Ethan reached for a locked drawer and pulled out a stack of papers. The property deed, purchase documents, tax history, everything his father had ever left him when he took over the restaurant. His father, Leonard, had died 5 years earlier, leaving behind a legacy built on charm and negotiation, but also rumors. He flipped through the yellowed pages, the smell of old paper mixing with the faint scent of roasted coffee drifting up from downstairs. Then, near the bottom of the pile, he found a document he'd never paid attention to, a handwritten appendix stapled behind the typed contract. The ink had faded, but the title was clear: Purchase Agreement, Conditional Addendum. His eyes narrowed as he read. The undersigned seller, Edward Morris, reserves the right to repurchase the property located at 241 Mercer Street upon written request within a period of 50 years from the date of sale, provided the premises remain used for commercial food service. Ethan froze. The date on the page, June 8, 1975. He did the math. 50 years. It was now May 2025, less than a month before the clause expired. He sat back, his chest tightening. It can't be real, he muttered. Dad would have told me. But his father's neat signature sat right there, beside another in careful cursive, Edward Morris. The pen trembled in Ethan's hand as he traced the lines. The air felt heavier. Beneath the legal text, someone, maybe his father, had scrawled in pencil, "Keep this quiet." A soft knock on the office door made him jump. "Ethan?" Chloe's voice. "You okay?" He hid the document under the photo. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just going over some old paperwork." She stepped in, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "I thought you might need this. You've been up here for hours." He accepted the cup but didn't drink. His mind was racing. "Chloe, did my dad ever mention who he bought this place from?" She thought for a moment. "I remember him saying something about an older man who fell sick and had to sell quick." "Why?" Ethan hesitated, his fingers brushing the hidden paper. No reason, just curious. But when she left, closing the door gently behind her, he unfolded the addendum again. He stared at the words until they blurred. 50 years. He stood abruptly, heart pounding. Downstairs, he could still hear the soft murmur of late-night customers. He imagined the old man's calm voice, the way he'd said, "A man's word isn't a joke." It wasn't a coincidence. It was a countdown. He pulled out his phone, opened a search bar, and typed, "Edward Morris, New York Bakery History." Dozens of articles appeared, mostly old, archived scans of local newspapers. And there, buried among them, one headline from 1974. "Local baker sells beloved Mercer Street shop to corporate buyer amid illness." Below it, a black and white photo of a young Edward, his face unmistakable, the same eyes that had stared across the counter just yesterday. Ethan's stomach turned. He scrolled further. Another article, dated only months later, reported the death of Edward's wife, Eleanor, from a sudden illness. The shop had closed soon after. The screen blurred for a second as Ethan's hand shook. He dropped the phone onto the desk and whispered, "My God." Then, as if on cue, a sound echoed from downstairs. The front door chime. He looked at the clock. 11:47 p.m. The cafe should have been locked. Ethan stood slowly, his pulse loud in his ears, and stared at the staircase. The faint aroma of coffee drifted up again, freshly brewed. The chime echoed again through the empty cafe, soft but chilling. Ethan froze halfway down the stairs, eyes fixed on the glow from the counter below. A figure stood there, the same old coat, the same stillness. Edward Morris. He wasn't holding an umbrella this time, just a weathered envelope pressed gently against his chest. Ethan descended the last few steps, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. "We're closed." Edward smiled faintly. "I know, but I thought you'd still be here." The lights hummed above them, flickering once before settling. The silence between them felt older than the walls. Ethan stepped closer. "You said this was your place once. You were right. I checked the records. There's something in the contract." Edward nodded slowly, as if he already knew. "The clause." Ethan hesitated. "So it's real? You kept it all this time?" The old man's hand tightened on the envelope. "I kept a promise. To my wife." He placed the envelope on the counter and slid it toward Ethan. "Everything you need to understand is in there." Ethan looked down but didn't open it. His throat felt dry. Why come now? After 50 years, Edward's gaze softened. "Because the time's up, for both of us." For a moment, neither spoke. The air smelled of coffee and rain-soaked asphalt. Then Edward said quietly, "Your father came to me when I was sick. He said he'd take care of the place, keep the name, keep the people. He didn't." His eyes glistened, but no tears fell. He erased it, painted over it, and I let him, because I thought I was dying. Ethan swallowed hard. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Edward said gently. "That's why I came to you, not to him." He turned, heading toward the door. Ethan called after him, voice cracking slightly. "Mr. Morris, wait. What do you want from me?" Edward paused with one hand on the door, the city lights spilling over his silhouette. "Respect," he said simply. Just that. And then he was gone again, swallowed by the sound of taxis and rain. Ethan opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside lay a copy of the original deed, a faded photograph of the bakery sign, and one short handwritten note. "If a man forgets where his bread came from, he loses more than his hunger." He stared at the words, the meaning sinking in like slow poison. Upstairs, the photograph of the Morris family still lay on his desk. For the first time, Ethan couldn't bear to look at it. Ethan didn't sleep that night. The words from Edward's note ran circles in his mind. If a man forgets where his bread came from, by sunrise, he'd made his decision. He needed to find him. He closed the cafe early, ignoring customers' confusion, and walked through the cold New York morning. The air smelled of rain and exhaust, and his reflection followed him in every glass window like a silent accusation. After hours of asking around, a local vendor pointed him toward a small apartment building 3 blocks away, the kind with cracked steps and flower pots clinging to life. He climbed the narrow stairwell until he reached the top floor. The door was slightly ajar. He knocked once gently. "Come in," a voice said from inside, calm, familiar. Edward sat by the window, sunlight spilling over his shoulders. A kettle whistled softly on the stove. On the table beside him lay stacks of papers, photographs, and a single worn-out leather folder. "You found me," Edward said, smiling faintly. Ethan stepped in, unsure how to begin. "I read your note. I found the deed. Everything." Edward nodded. "I thought you would." "I didn't know what my father did," Ethan said quietly. "If I had..." Edward raised a hand. "It's not about blame. It's about acknowledgement." Ethan moved closer, eyes on the folder. "What's in there?" Edward's gaze followed his. "Something I never meant to use. My wife wrote it before she died, her will. She wanted this place to live on, not as a business, but as a home for people who needed one." Ethan froze. "You mean, she wanted to turn the bakery into a community kitchen?" Edward said softly. "A place where no one would ever be turned away for not having enough." The silence after that was heavy. Ethan looked around the tiny apartment, The peeling paint, the quiet dignity of a man who had lost everything and still lived with grace. "I can't undo what my father did," Ethan said, "but I can make it right." Edward's eyes flickered with something, not hope, not forgiveness, but peace. "Maybe you can," he said, "or maybe the place will choose for itself." Before Ethan could answer, Edward slid the leather folder across the table. "Take it," he said. "You'll need it soon." Ethan hesitated. "Why?" Edward smiled faintly. "Because tomorrow, everything changes." The words lingered like a chill. Ethan looked down at the folder again. Its edges cracked, its contents a mystery. But when he looked up, Edward was already staring out the window, watching the city he'd once helped feed. The light caught his profile, and for a brief second, Ethan saw not an old man, but the echo of a baker, proud and young, covered in flour and hope. And in that moment, Ethan realized something terrifying. He didn't know if Edward had come back for peace or justice. By the next morning, the city felt colder. The sky hung low over Mercer Street, the air thick with that grey stillness that comes before a storm. Inside the cafe, Ethan sat alone, the leather folder open before him. Inside were papers, legal ones, some handwritten in fading blue ink. There were letters from Eleanor Morris, her handwriting delicate and precise, addressed to "Whoever runs this place after me." Each letter spoke of kindness, of feeding strangers, of giving dignity through something as simple as a warm loaf of bread. "If a place stops feeding hearts," she had written, "then it no longer deserves to serve food." Ethan rubbed his eyes, overwhelmed. He'd built his reputation on luxury, exclusivity, image. But this was something purer, something he'd never understood until now. The bell above the door rang. Edward entered slowly, leaning slightly on a cane this time. Chloe turned from behind the counter, her eyes softening. "Mr. Morris," she greeted. "You're back?" He nodded, smiling faintly. "One last cup of coffee, if you don't mind." Chloe looked at Ethan, unsure. He gave a small nod. "On the house," he said. Edward took a seat near the same window as before. The sunlight caught the steam from his cup, turning it gold. He stared through it like someone measuring time. Finally, Ethan approached him, the folder in hand. "I read everything," he said quietly. "Your wife's letters, the clause, all of it." Edward didn't look up. "Then you know what today is?" Ethan froze. "What do you mean?" Edward finally met his eyes. "The clause expires tonight at midnight. I can reclaim the property or let it go forever. I came to see what kind of man I'd be leaving it to." The words hit like a verdict. Ethan sat across from him, his pulse pounding. "You'd really take it back? After all this time?" Edward took a slow sip. "I came here with no intention of owning anything again, but I also can't leave a legacy in the wrong hands." Ethan leaned forward, desperate. "Then tell me what to do. How to make it right." The old man's voice softened, but his eyes stayed sharp. "You can't buy back integrity. You live it. Every day, every choice." A long silence stretched between them. Outside, thunder rolled across the skyline. Chloe turned off the music. The whole cafe seemed to hold its breath. Edward placed a small brass key on the table, the same one from his bakery photo, polished by time. "You'll know when to use this," he said quietly. "It belongs to this place more than either of us." Then he stood, buttoned his coat, and added, "Midnight decides, Ethan. The question is, what will you choose before the clock does?" And just like that, he walked out, leaving the door swinging softly behind him. Ethan stared at the key, its weight small but unbearable in his palm. Behind him, Chloe whispered, "What does he mean?" Ethan didn't answer. His gaze drifted toward the clock above the counter. It was 11:03 a.m., 13 hours until midnight. The clock above the counter ticked louder with every passing minute. The cafe was closed for the night, lights dimmed. Only the soft glow from the espresso machine painting the room in gold and shadow. Ethan sat at one of the tables, the brass key turning slowly between his fingers. Each rotation felt heavier. Outside, the rain had returned, tapping against the windows like a quiet countdown. He'd read Eleanor's letters again. Every word. Dignity, respect, kindness. They sounded simple, but to him, they now felt like foreign languages. Chloe entered quietly, a cardigan over her uniform. "You're still here," she said. He nodded. "I don't think I can leave until I figure out what to do." She walked over, sitting across from him. "You know, my grandmother told me something once," she said softly. "She used to come to the bakery that was here before your dad's restaurant. She said the man who owned it, Edward Morris, never charged a kid for bread. Ever." Ethan looked up, eyes wet. "He really did that?" She nodded. "She said he used to say hunger doesn't pay bills, but it builds people. I didn't even know what that meant until today." Ethan leaned back, covering his face with his hands. "All this time, I thought success was about what you could own. Now I'm sitting in a place I never really earned." The cafe fell silent again, only the rain and the ticking clock. Then suddenly, Ethan stood, determined. If this place was built on generosity, it deserves to be that again. He walked behind the counter, grabbed a piece of chalk and wiped clean the sleek blackboard where the expensive menu used to hang. Then, with rough strokes, he wrote new words. "Community coffee. Pay what you can." Chloe blinked. "Ethan, what are you doing?" "Changing the meaning," he said simply. "If he walks in tonight, I want him to see this before midnight." They worked together, turning the lights back on, setting up tables, making fresh pots of coffee. Slowly, curious passers-by began to peek in, drawn by the glowing sign and the scent of warmth on a cold, wet night. Some people came in soaked, offering only a few coins. Others left bills folded quietly on the counter, but no one was turned away. By 11:47 p.m., the cafe was full again, different this time. Laughter, kindness, the kind of noise that fills silence with purpose. And then, just as Ethan was refilling someone's cup, the doorbell chimed. He turned. Edward stood there, raincoat glistening, watching the scene in silence. His eyes softened when he saw the chalkboard. Ethan walked toward him, heart pounding. "You said midnight decides," he said quietly. "I made my choice early." For a long time, Edward said nothing. He just looked around, the tables, the people, the life in the room. Then finally he smiled. So did I. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a sealed envelope on the counter. "This is for you," he said. "But don't open it yet. Wait until the clock strikes." And with that he sat down at the same window seat, his reflection merging with the city lights beyond the glass. The second hand ticked toward midnight. The cafe held its breath. The clock struck midnight. For a moment nothing happened. The world outside Mercer Street Cafe seemed to freeze, the rain suspended mid-air, the hum of the city fading into an eerie calm. Ethan stood behind the counter, his hand resting over the envelope Edward had left. Everyone in the cafe turned to watch, feeling the same inexplicable weight in the air. He looked up. Edward was still at the window, his coffee untouched, eyes calm. Ethan took a breath and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No legal text, no deed, just a handwritten note in the same elegant script from the letters. "To the next man who owns these walls, you cannot buy back what was given in love, but you can keep it alive by giving it again. Eleanor and Edward Morris." Beneath the note lay a second item, the original bakery key, tied with a ribbon that had aged to pale gold. Ethan's hand trembled. "Mr. Morris," he whispered, but when he looked up, Edward was gone. The seat by the window was empty, the door still slowly swinging, as if he'd just stepped into the night. Chloe gasped softly. He didn't even finish his coffee. Ethan stared at the chair for a long moment. Then he smiled, small, real, unguarded. He looked down again at the note, then back at the cafe full of strangers sharing warmth and conversation. Something inside him, something buried beneath pride and ambition, finally loosened. He walked over to the front window, unlocked it, and pressed the brass key into the wooden frame above the sill. Then, turning to Chloe, he said quietly, "This key doesn't belong to me. It belongs to this place." The customers clapped softly. No applause, just gratitude. A few had tears in their eyes, though none knew why. Outside, the rain finally stopped. A faint light, morning perhaps, crept through the clouds. Ethan flipped the sign on the door. It no longer read closed or open. Chloe had written a new one earlier, in white chalk, Everyone welcome. He stood there for a while, staring at those words, before walking back to the counter and refilling his own cup. As the steam rose, he saw it, a faint reflection in the glass, the silhouette of Edward, smiling, tipping his hat, and fading with the first light of dawn. Ethan whispered, almost to himself, "Thank you." He turned to Chloe. "From now on," he said softly, "the coffee's always on the house for anyone who needs it." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "Then I guess this place is finally what it was meant to be." Outside, the sun broke through, spilling golden light over Mercer Street. The same color, perhaps, as the morning when a young baker once opened his shop with nothing but hope and his wife's laughter. And somewhere, in that light, the promise had finally been kept. The sun rose slowly over Mercer Street, painting the cafe windows in soft gold. Inside, the smell of coffee filled the air, warm, rich, alive. People talked, laughed, and lingered, not because of luxury, but because they felt welcome. Behind the counter, Ethan stood quietly, watching the morning unfold. The old brass key still hung above the window, catching the light like a tiny piece of memory. He smiled, different now, lighter, at peace. Every day, new faces came in. Some paid, some couldn't, but everyone left with something, a bit of kindness, a bit of warmth. And though Edward Morris was never seen again, his spirit stayed within the walls, like the scent of bread baked long ago. Ethan often looked at the door around closing time, half expecting to see the old man walk in again, tipping his hat with that quiet smile. But he never did. And maybe that was the point. Because sometimes, redemption doesn't arrive to be seen. It stays behind, to be lived. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heart-touching story. Tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Subscribe and turn on the bell to receive more stories that inspire and transform. Leave a like if you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family. And above all, thank you for being part of this community that believes in stories with soul. And before you go, watch the story. I leave here on the left. I'm sure it will also move you and make you reflect.